From Caracas, I'm Cody Weddle. Recently, Russia announced plans to involve itself in the conflict in Syria. Now, since then, Russians have begun carrying out airstrikes targeting the Islamic State group there and some other militant groups to analyze that situation, Russia's involvement, in general, the situation in Syria. Today, I'm joined by Omar Hassann. He is he's a professor of international relations. Now, there are several ways we could describe the situation in Syria, but I think it could be described for people who don't follow it closely as sort of just jumbled, confusing. There are so many actors. There are so many people trying to influence Syria.
You got that right.
Who are the main players here? What are the main influences, the main groups that we should be aware of and our viewers should be aware of?
Well, that's not a short list, but let's try to go through it. On the local level, we have the Syrian government, which is headed by the son of the former president, Hafez al-Assad. His name is Bashar, and a coalition of military officers and whatnot from the Syrian armed forces that is in control of the state, of the Syrian state. At the same time, we have several splinter groups and several organizations that want to topple that government down, and they are not united. There exist like at least 3 or 4 groups. The 3 most important ones are the ones they call themselves the Syrian Free Army. That includes Islamist and non-Islamist elements. Then you have another organization which is the equivalent of, which is actually the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. This is headed by a man called Al-Gulani, and he is Syrian, but he is the head of Al-Qaeda there. And then there is the third group, which is the most nefarious one of all, which is the so-called Islamic State. Not ISIS, Islamic State. It no longer has that Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It no longer has that name. That's at the local level. At the regional level, the most important players would be Hezbollah, which is a militia group of Shia in Lebanon, who are supporting the government in Damascus. And of course we have the government of Saudi Arabia, several governments of the Gulf states, and the government and armed forces and special forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's at the regional level. Now, when we expand at the global level, the most important players would have to be, of course, the United States, the European Union, and recently Russia, the Russian Federation. There are other actors, but they are secondary. But it's a mess in there.
Right. Let's talk about the global players, the main ones being really Russia and the U.S. and the European Union as well. The U.S. had been carrying out airstrikes on the Islamic State in Syria. Recently, Russia said it would also begin airstrikes. They're debating views of who's doing a better job there, and certainly the U.S. wants to portray Russia as targeting other groups as well. Talk about that desire, or that dynamic for influence between Russia and the U.S. in Syria.
Well, see, the problem here is that some people have the tendency to focus on this issue as if it were a Syrian issue. We must have a broader look. Now, the thing here is, I'm a university professor, and when we talk about international relations with my students, I always tell them the conservative analysis in international relations has a tendency to separate and fragment. Alternatively, critical view has the job of unmasking power relations and integrating and joining what conservative analysis disintegrates and divides. And this case is it fits perfectly with the situation of how this situation is analyzed. And here's the problem. We cannot see this conflict as if it were a regional conflict. And when we see it as a global conflict, we have to take in consideration so many other factors that have happened before, that Western media and Western leaders have a very terrible tendency to separate because it's convenient for them. We have to take it into consideration that since 2008, perhaps even before, there has been a very intense Cold War that's been taking place between Washington on the one hand and between Moscow and Beijing on the other. We must make emphasis that this is not a continuation of the original Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it's not an ideological debate. It is merely a debate over power and influence in international affairs.
Why is it important to separate and to realize that this is not a continuation of the First Cold War?
Because there are certain factors that are not available or not present in the actual conflict that were before. Okay. And those factors are the ones that are usually used as an excuse by certain analysts to claim that there is no Cold War. But there is one. And it's been done, and it's been, but the fact that it's a Cold War, it's not because there's an ideological debate, but because there's a conflict of interest where the two antagonists do not fight each other directly, but always on a third ground. Okay. The Soviet Union and the United States did that over Berlin, 1948. And the issue was not Berlin. The issue was the conflict between both powers. Syria, unfortunately for Syrians and Arabs in general, is just the Berlin of 2014 and 2015. Now, why is there a Cold War in the first place? Well, this is the part where Western media has a tendency to separate things. We never hear that Russian motivation, aside from it being an aggressive and evil nation, we never hear the connection between the aggressive stance that the US government had in pushing Georgia into creating a war with Russia in 2008. Mm-hmm. That, of course, didn't go too well for the United States, unfortunately for them. And we also have a tendency to forget that the troubles in Ukraine were not started by the government in Moscow, but they were started by certain foreign governments, and not so much in the European Union, but definitely in the United States, that made sure that a pro-Moscow government collapses, and whatever came to replace it was something not only very anti-Moscow, but extremely fascist. And that was a very serious problem. What was the United States trying to do? It was trying to put its hands over the port, over Sebastopol. I mean, that's a deep water port, the only one that Russia actually has in the moment to have access to the Black Sea, and of course from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. That's the most important port that Russia has. And it's warm water too, because most of the ones they have in the north are always frozen. So that was a very gigantic, very important strategic coup that the United States was going to give Russia, was actually going to take it out of the game completely. But they couldn't, because Russia rushed in and took that part for itself, because it was originally Russian in the first place, and it's full of Russians anyway. That, of course, all that is connected to what's happening in Syria right now. But of course, the Western media divides that, separates that, pretends that has nothing to do. But if you have a very aggressive posture against Moscow, you have to expect that Moscow is going to defend itself. And the international game, or well, just like the great game from 1800, the new geopolitical game actually right now is between those two. But we must include China in the conflict, because China is even a more important rival. It's just not a military rival, it's more of an economic one, and it's actually quite successful for the United States. Mm-hmm. But it actually has a very strong strategic alliance with Russia at the moment, which of course is very problematic for the United States, and that's why the United States has extremely aggressive policy towards Russia and towards China. It's part of the Cold War.
And why Syria? Why have they chosen Syria to sort of fight that battle for influence?
Well, more than anything, it's just because that's what's present at the moment. Okay. And also because the moment itself presents with two rivaling factors in Syria that each one can reach out and ask for help from one of those two rivaling powers. The United States presented itself in trying to help the non-terrorist groups of the resistance, which I still don't know how they managed to differentiate between them, because the most successful elements that are resisting the government and right now are either the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda people. So again, I don't know how exactly.
Clearly, by most definitions, those are very extremist terrorist organizations.
Yes, but they're the most successful ones, and they say that they're helping the successful ones, but not the terrorist ones. How exactly that works, we still are in mystery about this. We don't know how it works.
Are there moderate elements that are fighting against the Assad government?
I must admit, I don't know, because I don't know what moderate means. You see, moderate has 20 or 30 different definitions depending on who's defining them. So moderate could be, sometimes even Al-Qaeda could be moderate if Al-Qaeda is fighting an enemy that the United States shares. So again, it's very, very flexible, this moderate thing. So we can't really tell which groups are moderate and which are not, but apparently only the United States Armed Forces is the one that can tell, because they keep supplying weapons to them, and somehow it ends up miraculously with the moderate ones like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Again, when you said it's confusing and it's a mess, I agree with you.
But all of these elements are very fractured. There's not a unified front fighting
fighting the government?
Fighting the government.
There are at least 4 or 5, but even within each of those 4 or 5, there's still more fragmentation.
Talk about the U.S. The U.S. wants Assad out. For the U.S., what would a perfect Syria look like, in their opinion?
You know, I think a Syria that doesn't exist on the map is perhaps the only Syria that would look perfect for them. Well, let's put it to you this way. A Syria that has a government that is willing to do anything possible to please Tel Aviv. That would be ideal. A government that is willing to fight extremist organizations, except the extremist organizations that the United States need to use to keep balkanizing the region, like the Islamic State. That's why Russia just started throwing bombs over them, and they actually had some results, modest one, but they have had something. The United States has, what, 2 years throwing bombs at them? And for some reason, they're actually bigger than they were when the United States started throwing those bombs. We don't know exactly how that works either, but it seems that that's the case. So you can't be too effective in destroying the Islamic State because you need it to continue balkanizing the region. That seems to be the prevailing logic here. Aside from that, basically a government that will keep to itself, do whatever it's told, and not cause too many ripples in U.S. foreign policy in the region. Now, I take the opportunity here to mention, because we've only touched the highest level of the conflict, but there is yet another level that makes this even more confusing, and that is another geopolitical conflict of a very Cold War variety, but definitely at the regional level. And that's between Iran. Between Riyadh and Tehran. I think those are the main antagonists that are fighting. They're fighting it out quite viciously throughout the entire Middle East. It's not just Syria. It's Iraq, it's Bahrain, it's definitely in Yemen. It's all over the place, really. Because Saudi Arabia seems to have the leadership of part of the Arab Sunni world, while whatever might be Shia, generally speaking, not all the Shia, but a lot of Shia groups seem to have some sort of understanding with the government in Tehran, supporting it, so on and so forth. But again, I highlight, not all the Shia. The government in Syria, for example, has a lot of Alawi factors in them. And the Alawiyin are officially a Shia group since 1960s or 1970s. Before the 1970s, they weren't even Shia, but they are Shia now. So there is that connection there as well. But the most important thing we need to understand is that Saudi Arabia is in a very profound geopolitical conflict with Iran throughout the entire region. Like any Cold War, they're not shooting it out against each other, but they're doing it on third territories.
I assume some examples would be Yemen, for one.
That's the best example there is, the best. And the fact is, Iran itself is not actually present in the conflict, but it is the one that supports the Houthiyyin, whom, of course, are Shia as well. So we have to take that into consideration. But there are other factors. The Iraqi question, let's not forget the Islamic State that everybody's throwing bombs at. Although they're throwing more bombs in Syria than Iraq, which I think is also very interesting and curious, the fact is they were born in Iraq. You see, and at the same time, Iraq has a very Shia-dominated government that cooperates very closely with Tehran. This is actually a major issue for governments like the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular. So that whole conflict is actually being dumped on Syrian territory, and it's playing out there. The only people who are actually paying the price are Syrians and Lebanese and all the communities around it, the Kurds as well, let's not forget those, the Turks now, but that conflict continues. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse, I think.
So as an opportunity for influence, the desire or the interests aren't really within Syria, but for influence.
Yes, it's a battle, but it's such a complex battle because there are not only several actors, but there are several levels of actors. We cannot compare Saudi Arabia or Iran to United States and Russia. Not because the ones are more relevant than others, but because they're playing at a very different level of logic. The United States and Russia are in a global conflict at several points on the planet. While Saudi Arabia and Iran have limited their reach in their conflict to the region of the Middle East, perhaps all the way up to Pakistan, but that's about it. It's a very different logic. And then when you bring in someone like Hezbollah from Lebanon and its relationship or its fight with a Zionist entity, but it's, shall we say, semi-friendly relationship with a group like Hamas, who is Islamist as well, but Sunni in Palestine, then you have a completely different kind of a mess. Mess in the sense that it's complicated to analyze and gives much more complexity to the situation. But it's operating on an extremely different logic from the logic of the so-called Cold War powers. You see what I mean? So this is why this part of the world is definitely the most complicated and complex one. Not only because it's divided into so many sub-elements, ethnic groups, languages, so on and so forth, but because it's a multiplicity of layers of players, a lot of them regional and international. I take the opportunity right now to highlight this issue about the different ethnic groups and linguistic ones. Something that makes analysis extremely difficult is the fact that there are a lot of ethnic groups, languages, religions, and whatnot, but you have to understand that is the outer layer of the conflict. There are no Shia-Sunni conflicts. There are no conflicts because I don't like your religion or your language is stupid or ridiculous or I don't accept it or you look different than I do. No, there are no conflicts of that nature. It is not a clash of civilization. This is a clash for material and socio-economic conflicts, and it is a search for power. It is just like it was in Europe during the 30-Year War. It wasn't a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. It was a war for power, and this is exactly what's happening there. It makes it very difficult, the fact that some of them, unfortunately, these are Shia, these are Sunni, these are Christians, these are other type of Christians, these are Kurds. Oh no, these are Sunni, but they're not Arabs. All that mess is important to know because it guides the fault lines of the conflict, but they're not the major structural motivations for the conflict. They never are, they never will be. It will always be about money, land, and power.
I was going to say, you could probably argue that every war that has ever existed is really, at its core, about those issues.
Yeah, darn tootin'.
Let's go back to Syria. Russia says it's only targeting the Islamic State. The U.S. continues to say that it's targeting those opposition groups to the government. Who should we believe here? Does it matter?
To a certain degree, yeah, you're right about the fact that whether it matters or not, because unfortunately they say this and then they say that. At the end, the number of Syrian corpses just keeps piling up. I remember once when I heard a Syrian wondering, why is it that so many people in the world felt so terrible when this little Syrian child was drowned on the coast trying to reach Europe? If that makes you cry, just come on to Syria. We have 10,000 of those kids killed every month. Is that kid more important than the other 10,000 that are killed? I think, of course, that's a very important argument. But beyond that, again, it's not an issue of whether who's bombing more or who's bombing less. The issue is that they are fighting over power on a territory that's not theirs. Now, Russia is trying to show the United States that they are not the owners of the planet. The United States is trying to convince everybody else that they are. It seems that the United States is not in the position that George Herbert Bush was in 1991, because it didn't have any rivals then. Now it has, and it has two. And the most important rival is not Russia, it's China, because it's much more successful at rivaling the United States. Problem is, there is a small little monster in the Middle East that's called the, and I hate saying this because I'm a Muslim myself, but it's called the Islamic State, which has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. It is the most unique and spectacular little monster that has ever existed in the history of mankind, because it seems that there is the largest international coalition in the history of mankind to destroy it, and for some reason it's actually bigger now.
Right.
This is just an impressive phenomenon. 200 years from now, they're going to study this and they're going to ask, why? How the hell did that happen? And it keeps happening. Because you have to ask yourself, are they really trying to kill it off? I mean, you're trying to kill a small little fly with a nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon should devastate it and devastate everything around it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be killing that. It keeps getting bigger and stronger and better coordinated, and it receives more weapons, a lot of it actually US weapons, and it keeps receiving more cars and trucks and modes of transport, and it gets more money, and they keep saying it's because oil is worth $40 a barrel right now. Where is the rest of that money that they have coming from? No one seems to answer those questions. The only thing we hear is the Russians are bombing civilians, the United States are bombing civilians. And that's it. We don't hear anything else. We don't see anything that leads us for this conflict to actually reduce, to come to an end. We don't see that. It just gets worse and worse and worse.
And where we're seeing that is in Western media. Talk about Western media, and you were talking earlier about how they along with the U.S. State Department, sort of try to separate this issue in Syria from other issues that Russia has been involved in. Tell me about Western media coverage and how it's approached this story.
Well, this is what they do. They're very efficient at it. Western media can never be seen as journalism. It actually is just one more soldier in the good fight. And they're very efficient at it. They take whatever politicians need to say and make it sound better, depending, of course, on which politician and which side. And they're doing that, and they're doing it at the best level that they can. And right now, the idea is to create the image that the United States goes into Syria, flies at planes, drops a lot of weapons, a lot of bombs over unknown targets, and goes back to its bases in the Middle East. They're doing a good job. Russia flies its planes, drops a lot of bombs on targets on Syria, then they go back to their bases on the Middle East. And they're doing a terrible job. So they're both doing exactly the same thing, exactly the same way, but one is pure Satanism, and the other one is a champion of peace. And I don't exactly know why, since they're doing exactly the same thing. And they keep saying that the other one is killing civilians, is killing civilians. Well, you know what? Russia just started on this. So whatever the civilians the Russians are killed is an extremely small amount compared to all the civilians that the United States have already killed in the last 2 years, and in the last, 14 years that it's been in Afghanistan, for example? Because I don't hear anybody crying about the civilians in Afghanistan that the United States have killed. It seems that those civilians are okay, but the civilians supposedly that Russia are killing in Syria, that's just not good. That's just not good. So the duplicity in the foreign policy is reflected in the duplicity of the Western media in how it handles this.
And they have a peculiar way of sort of picking little details from each conflict and then presenting those details, but sort of turning a blind eye to others.
And the others are not little details, they're huge.
Right.
You see?
Their lives, their people.
Not just those, but a very large detail, like for example, Vladimir Putin and Russia were trying to mind their own business until they found one of their neighbors trying to attack them in 2008. When you find the United States aggressively trying to expand NATO until it reaches all the borders of Russia. Now that is supposed to be something peaceful and acceptable. But I wonder if anybody tries to talk the Mexican government to join them in an aggressive posture against the United States. As a matter of fact, supposedly during the First World War, the German Kaiser actually tried to do that. And that was the reason for the United States to join the First World War, because it's unacceptable that they try to have an alliance with a sovereign state that it's on its borders. But Russia now has to accept that. And apparently, if it doesn't, then it's trying to destroy world peace. Mm-hmm. Those issues are the ones that explain to us not only the Ukraine, not only Crimea, but definitely explains us other things like Syria and beyond.
All right, well, that's where we'll have to end it today. Thanks so much for joining us. Very fascinating analysis.
It's been a pleasure.
Talking about Syria, but also the other global implications and dynamics. And thank you for joining us for this episode of From Caracas. We'll see you again next week.